Under the amber glow of the hospital lamps, the night carried with it a hush that felt almost sacred, a silence broken only by the rhythmic hum of passing cars and the distant echo of footsteps on the frozen pavement. The world seemed to be asleep, yet something lingered outside those cold glass doors, something that could not be dismissed. A slender figure, wrapped in a worn coat, standing as though tethered to the very threshold of fate. She wasn't like the other visitors who rushed in and out with anxious expressions and hurried movements. She remained still, waiting, her eyes fixed on the hospital entrance as though it were the doorway to her entire existence. That quiet persistence, that stillness against the restless backdrop of the city, drew the attention of Dr. Nathaniel, whose days and nights had blurred into an endless cycle of patients and sterile corridors. He was a man of habit, unyielding in discipline, his heart long encased in the armor of duty. Yet in that instant he found his gaze caught, as if the threads of destiny had tugged sharply at the edges of his soul. The winter air curled like a breath of sorrow around her, carrying flakes of snow that settled into her dark hair, framing her in a halo both fragile and defiant. There was something haunting about her posture, not desperation, but devotion, as if she belonged to the shadows yet refused to vanish. He wondered why she stood there night after night, unmoving, guarding a secret she seemed unwilling to share. And though reason urged him to look away, his heart stirred with an unfamiliar ache, an impulse he had buried for years beneath the weight of responsibility. It was in her stillness that he felt the tremor of a story untold, and within himself the faint crack of walls he thought would never fall. He left the hospital with his scarf drawn high against the cold, but his steps faltered, his eyes drawn once more to her fragile figure outlined in pale lamplight. She did not look at him, yet her presence spoke to him with a language deeper than words. It was a language of waiting, of longing, of promises whispered into the night. The sight of her lingered in his mind long after he had walked away, trailing behind him like the scent of memory that refuses to fade. Sleep eluded him, for in the solitude of his room he could still see her, silent yet radiant, like a wounded star refusing to extinguish its light. There was something in her sorrow that reached into him, touching a place long numb, and he knew he could not let the mystery remain unsolved. Each evening thereafter, he sought her with his eyes the moment he stepped beyond the hospital's revolving doors. She was always there, as constant as the breath of winter, her silhouette unwavering against the currents of life around her. The nurses whispered, the staff exchanged knowing glances, but no one dared to approach. To them, she was a phantom of grief, a soul tethered to a memory too heavy to release. To him, she was a question that ignited the quiet fire of his heart, a question he felt destined to answer. And so, while his hands healed the bodies of children within sterile walls, his mind drifted toward the figure outside, a living contradiction, fragile yet unyielding, broken yet whole enough to wait through every icy hour. The hospital had always been to him a place of beginnings and endings, a threshold where life entered and departed in equal measure. But now it became something more. For each night he knew she would be there, anchoring the cold corridors with a strange, inexplicable warmth. He began to wonder if fate had placed her there not just to endure her own vigil, but to awaken his. The pull was undeniable, like a tide drawing him toward the shore of a truth he had long ignored. And beneath the weight of his curiosity, beneath the quiet drum of his lonely heart, a seed of something tender began to bloom. If these words touch your heart, if they stir in you the gentle ache of love and the healing reminder that even in silence, stories breathe, let your presence be felt. Leave your thoughts in the quiet of a comment. Let your voice be a part of this unfolding tale. If this moment has wrapped around your soul like a warm scarf against winter's chill, support with a simple like, or subscribe so that together we may continue weaving threads of stories that bring comfort, tenderness, and hope. For every story shared is a light, and perhaps this light will lead us softly, inevitably, into the next chapter where silence begins to speak and hearts begin to listen. Snow fell in gentle whispers that evening, the kind of snowfall that softened the world into silence, where every flake seemed like a fragile blessing drifting from heaven. The hospital glowed in the distance like a lantern of life against the dark, and as Dr. Nathaniel stepped into the night air, he searched almost instinctively, his gaze sweeping across the entrance before he even realized what he was doing. She was there again, just as constant as the moon above, her figure wrapped in quiet solitude, a silhouette carved against the restless hum of the city. The world hurried past her, cars rushing by, footsteps echoing in haste, but she remained still, as though her very presence was stitched into the fabric of that place. He found himself pausing, unable to move forward, his breath clouding in the frost as he studied her from afar. Her eyes were cast toward the glass doors, their reflection catching fragments of the fluorescent glow from within, as if she were trying to see through the walls that separated her from someone or something precious. There was no desperation in her expression, no frantic searching of the crowd. Instead, there was a calm sorrow, the kind that carries both pain and strength, a devotion so steady it seemed almost divine. Nathaniel's heart, hardened by years of discipline and quiet loneliness, trembled in recognition of something he had long forgotten, what it meant to wait, what it meant to hope, even when hope seemed foolish. He remembered the whispers of the nurses, that she had been seen night after night, waiting at the same spot, never entering, never leaving until dawn painted the horizon. Some said she waited for a lover lost within the sterile walls. Others whispered of a family member taken too soon. None knew for certain, and perhaps that uncertainty was what gave her presence its haunting beauty. She was not a woman clinging desperately to denial, but rather a soul keeping vigil, as if love itself demanded she remain until the story inside the hospital had truly reached its end. As he lingered, he realized the pull she had over him was not born merely of curiosity, but something far deeper. Her stillness seemed to breathe into him, as though her silence carried a healing rhythm, unraveling the knots he had long bound tight around his own heart. He had buried his grief for years, tucked it neatly away behind his work and his white coat, convincing himself that service was enough to replace what he had lost. But watching her, he felt the ache of his own unspoken wounds begin to stir, not in torment, but in the way a wound stirs when light first touches it, tender yet healing. One evening, unable to suppress the tug of fate any longer, he allowed his steps to carry him closer. The crunch of his shoes against the frosted pavement filled the air, and with each movement his heart drummed louder, a rhythm that felt uncharacteristically alive. She turned slightly at the sound, her eyes lifting to meet his for the briefest of moments, and in that single glance he felt the depth of 1,000 unshed tears, the gravity of years of love and longing. There was a fragility in her, yes, but also a resilience that shone like a hidden flame. He stopped a few feet away, the air between them trembling with words unspoken. He wanted to ask her why she came, whom she waited for, what story tethered her to these doors night after night. But the questions froze on his tongue, replaced instead by a reverence for the moment itself. It was enough, he realized, simply to share the silence. He remained there with her, the hospital at their backs, the winter sky above, and the quiet comfort of presence between them. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt less alone, not because of words exchanged, but because in her eyes he saw mirrored the truth of his own loneliness. From that night onward, a subtle ritual formed. He would leave the hospital at the close of his shift and find her there, waiting. Sometimes he would pause at a distance, allowing his gaze to rest on her, as though her stillness could steady the turbulence of his mind. Other times he drew near, standing quietly at her side, both of them looking toward the entrance with an unspoken understanding. Their companionship was wordless, yet it carried a warmth that slipped into his soul like sunlight filtering through winter clouds. The healing he had never sought began to find him in her presence, the quiet reminder that sorrow need not isolate, but could bind two hearts in shared humanity. The days bled into weeks, and her figure became as much a part of the hospital as its stone steps and glowing windows. Yet Nathaniel's heart began to ache, not just with curiosity, but with the longing to know her story, to understand the shadow that drew her night after night into the cold. His compassion, once reserved for his patients alone, now stretched toward her with a tenderness he could no longer disguise. And though she remained veiled in mystery, he sensed that beneath her silence lay a truth that could unravel both their lives and stitch them back together in ways neither could yet imagine. The wind carried with it the scent of snow and the hush of destiny, and Nathaniel knew that fate was weaving something delicate between them. Each night he stood nearer, each glance shared grew longer, each breath beside her drew them closer to the moment when silence would finally give way to revelation. And as the world turned, as the hospital doors swung endlessly open and shut for others, he felt that his own story had only just begun, woven into hers, waiting patiently for its first true chapter to unfold. The third night he drew near, the winter air was sharper, the kind that bit at the edges of skin and wrapped the world in a brittle stillness. Yet she stood there again, unwavering, her figure half illumined by the pale glow of the lamps. This time Nathaniel did not stop at a distance. He carried with him a paper cup of coffee, its warmth steaming in the air, and with hesitant steps he offered it to her. She hesitated, her eyes flickering between his outstretched hand and the dark sky above, before finally reaching forward, her fingers brushing his in the briefest, quietest touch. That single contact sent something unspoken through him, as if her silence had finally reached across to his silence, binding them in a thread finer than breath. She whispered a thank you, her voice so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, yet it sank deep into him, healing some unseen fracture he had carried for years. She lifted the cup to her lips, cradling it as though it held more than warmth, perhaps safety, perhaps recognition, and for the first time Nathaniel noticed the trembling of her hands. Not weakness, but the trembling of a heart carrying too much. He wanted to speak, to soothe, to invite her into a story shared instead of endured alone, but her gaze was fixed once more on the hospital doors. There was devotion in her stare, a yearning that could not be interrupted. And so he remained at her side, letting silence speak in the way words never could. That night he lingered longer than he had before, his own body resisting the call of home. Something in her presence drew him like gravity, and he realized how different the world felt when she stood beside him, the air gentler, the cold less harsh, the night softer. As the hospital quieted and the last visitors trickled out, he found himself asking quietly, almost against his own will, "Who is it you wait for?" She did not answer, but her eyes glistened, and in that glisten was 1,000 stories, too heavy to be spoken, yet too alive to be hidden. She turned slightly, the curve of her lips carrying both pain and tenderness, and though no answer came, he understood that her silence was not rejection, but a wound still healing, one that needed time before words could flow. He respected that silence, choosing not to push further. Instead, he sat on the low stone steps beside her, his coat brushing against hers, the space between them small enough for their breaths to mingle in the cold. Together they watched the doors, two souls tethered by something neither had yet named. He realized then that companionship was not always born of conversation. Sometimes it was born of stillness, of waiting with another until their burdens became less heavy. And in that moment he felt himself healing in ways he had never sought, simply by being near her, simply by staying. The following evenings became a quiet ritual. He would emerge from the hospital weary, his shoulders bowed with the weight of endless responsibility, and there she would be, standing like a lighthouse in the night. He would bring small offerings, tea, a scarf, even a book he thought she might like. Yet more often than not, she accepted only the warmth of his presence. Slowly, carefully, the silence began to thin, and fragments of her story emerged in the spaces between breaths. She spoke one evening of how the hospital had swallowed someone dear to her, someone she could not let go of. And though she did not speak the name, Nathaniel heard the echo of love and grief in her voice, each word a fragment of her soul. He listened, not as a doctor taking in the details of a case, but as a man aching to cradle the fragile truth of another heart. Her sorrow, instead of driving him away, drew him closer. He found himself yearning to shield her from the cold, to be the strength she leaned on when her own legs trembled. And in turn she began to look at him differently, not as a stranger, not even as the doctor bound to the building behind them, but as a presence she could trust. Her eyes lingered on him longer, her lips softened when he spoke, her posture eased when he stood near. What had begun as a silent vigil was transforming, slowly, tenderly, into companionship. There were nights when her grief grew heavier, when her tears glimmered in the lamplight and her voice broke into fragments. In those moments, Nathaniel did not speak to mend what could not yet be mended. He simply let his presence wrap around her like a blanket, steady and warm. And when she leaned against him, even if just for a fleeting second, he felt the weight of her pain pressed into him, and he carried it willingly, as though sharing it could lighten her soul. Each time, a healing warmth filled the hollow places inside him, the ones he had ignored for years, and he began to understand that her story was not just hers, it was becoming theirs. Time moved differently in those nights. The hospital's hum, once monotonous and cold, now pulsed with an unseen rhythm that tied them together. Every passing evening deepened the thread between them, until Nathaniel could no longer imagine stepping into the night without first seeing her there, waiting. She was no longer simply the woman at the door. She had become a part of his own heartbeat, the reason his steps slowed, the reason his eyes softened, the reason he felt something like hope return to his chest. As winter deepened, the world grew harsher, yet the bond between them warmed like a hearth flame against the storm. And Nathaniel knew, as he stood beside her night after night, that the question was no longer whether he would uncover the truth she carried, but whether, when the moment came, he would be brave enough to hold her story in his own hands and never let it fall. The thought lingered in him like a promise, and as he looked at her, the snow catching in her hair, the sorrow in her gaze softened by trust, he felt the quiet certainty that their lives had already begun to entwine, leading them gently, inevitably, into the next revelation waiting to unfold. The truth arrived the way dawn does, quietly at first, a paler grey along the horizon of their nights, then, all at once, a spill of light that made everything else rearrange itself around it. It began with the smallest consent. She accepted the scarf he brought, a soft woolen warmth, the colour of rain-soaked stone, and when he draped it over her shoulders, she did not flinch. Her gaze, which had always been held like a lantern toward the doors, shifted to him for longer than a heartbeat. In that gaze he felt the hinge of something turning, trust loosening the chain it had wrapped around her story. The hospital exhaled its fluorescent breath behind them, and a low wind braided the night with the faintest scent of eucalyptus from the trees that lined the curb. Nathaniel stood beside her, the way one stands beside a prayer, reverently, without hurry. He had learned her silences the way one learns a coastline in fog, by listening for the rock beneath the waves. He said little, brought small offerings, moments of presence, pockets of quiet, where she could rest the weight of whatever she carried. Sometimes he simply counted breaths with her, a gentle rhythm, 4 in, 6 out, something he used to teach anxious children when fear rattled their ribs. He did not know it would work on his own heart until it did, a soft healing that felt like the inside of a lullaby. One evening, frost netted the corners of the railings, and a pale moon unspooled itself over the parking lot. Nathaniel arrived later than usual, the kind of late that leaves a thin ache at the back of the neck. He had delivered difficult news to a family. The echo of their grief still trembled in his hands. He found her in her usual place, a tense stillness to her body, like a violin held just before a note is drawn. He offered a thermos of chamomile, his voice gentler than he knew it could be. And for the first time she spoke his name, not the one embroidered on his coat, but the one she had learned from the nurses who spoke of him with soft respect. "Nathaniel," she said, the syllables warm in the cold. "Can we sit?" They settled on the low stone steps, steam rising in small ghostly swirls from their cups. The night hummed, lanes of headlights drawing lines of quiet gold beyond the curb. She drew the scarf closer, held the thermos with both hands as if to cradle steadiness. Her eyes were darker than the sky, and in their depths he recognized the first ripple of a tide that had been held too long. "I don't come here for the person you think," she began, the corners of her mouth making a small, brave shape. "At least, not the way it looks." He waited. He had learned the discipline not of medicine now, but of listening, which is a kind of medicine too. "My mother," she said, and the word carried the weight of 1,000 folded afternoons. Worked here 34 years, pediatrics. She had a way with the smallest ones, the ones who looked like breath might forget them if someone didn't remind it to stay. A smile touched her lips. It touched his chest in the same place her first thank you had landed. She used to say there are two kinds of courage in this world, the kind that charges forward and the kind that stays. She taught me staying was its own brave. Nathaniel's breath slowed. He had known a handful of nurses whose hands were their own kind of light, who could find a vein by instinct, a fear by feeling. He could see this woman's mother among them, see the starch-softened scrubs, the pen tucked behind one ear, the tiny, steady miracles no chart had room to praise. There was a day, she continued, and her voice thinned like sugar in tea, when she didn't come home. A car took a light too fast. The hospital called me, but by the time I arrived, her throat moved. I didn't know how to make sense of a world where my mother stopped existing. The place she spent her life became the place that took it from me. For months I couldn't come near this block. He did not speak. The urge to gather her in both arms surged through him, not as impulse, but as a vow. He kept still, offering the steadiness of his shoulder without taking the right to hold it. Then one winter, she said, I passed by at dusk and saw a child slam his palm against the glass and laugh when a nurse blew him a kiss from the other side. It was like a seam opened. This building did not take her. It received her last breath the way she received so many, gently. I remembered the children who lived because she stayed. I remembered how she believed doors meant both entry and exit, and that neither was the end of a story, only a passage. Since then, Nathaniel said softly, you've kept vigil. She nodded. I wait at the threshold where her life held its light. I tell myself I'm not waiting for her to appear. I know how bodies work, how endings work, but for my heart to be brave in the way she taught, staying. Sometimes families come and go. Sometimes they don't know where to place their hands. I've tied scarves, brewed tea, called rides, sat with grandmothers whose stories couldn't find a place to land. I guess I became a shadow worker. She smiled again, wan but real. Not a saint, just a daughter who didn't know how to leave. The truth unscrolled between them like ribbon in lamplight. Nathaniel felt the click of every unnamed piece sliding into place, the direction of her gaze, the hour she arrived, the compassion in how she watched strangers, an alchemy of grief made generous. It wasn't the vigil of denial. It was fidelity transfigured into service. Love practicing the art of staying until it became a quiet shelter for others. "What is your name?" he asked, and it felt like asking a star who it wanted to be called in a sky crowded with them. "Mira," she said. "My mother named me for the star that brightens slowly." She looked toward the doors. "She used to take me stargazing, said everything that looks like disappearance might only be a season of dimming." Mira. The name nested in him like a small bird, warm and alive. He tasted the shape of it in his mouth and found that it fit the way a key fits a lock it was made for. He told her his own name then, not the one the hospital used, but the inflections beneath it, how his grandmother had stitched it into blankets, how his childhood had been a hallway of closed doors after his father left. He spoke of medicine chosen like a vow, not to outrun loneliness, but to give it work that mattered. He had not told anyone this in years. The words came like water to a dry root. "I thought I had no language left," Mira said after a long minute. And then you stood here, and the language didn't need to be clever. It just needed to be listened to." A small laugh flickered. "I have watched men grieve by leaving. I didn't expect to meet one who stayed." Nathaniel did not say that he had stayed for her. He did not yet know how to speak the truth without tilting it. But his body knew. He felt himself aligning around this woman's presence the way a compass needle answers north. They began, after that night, to make small rituals out of their staying. He brought a thermos and 2 cups. She brought a folded napkin with 2 pieces of lemon shortbread she had baked on a day when memory had a softer mouth. He pointed out the little things in the night sky above the parking deck. Jupiter sitting fat on the shoulder of the moon, Orion's belt knocked askew by city glow. She pointed out the little things in the human sky, the way a mother exhaled relief like a lantern after a long surgery, the way an orderly whispered jokes to a boy with a bandaged chin, the way grief, when witnessed, stepped down from its terror and became, for a minute, something a body could hold. He found her mother then, not in a file, though a nurse named Alma, who knew the seamstress of every wing, told him where to look, but in the residues of other people's gratitude. A pair of crocheted booties kept in a drawer of Lost and Found had a note pinned to them in fading ink. "For the nurse who sat with my daughter until morning." A crayon drawing taped to the back of a supply closet door, left there for years, perhaps by accident, showed a mop-haired stick figure with a speech bubble that read, "Nurse Mira's mom, you make me brave." And there, in the small chapel, no one visited unless a life was either splitting or healing, he found a typed list of memorial names folded in the hymnal, her mother's name among them. He carried the list to Mira as one carries a candle, and she took it as if he had put a warm stone in her palm. They did not need to speak. It felt like a circle closing with tenderness instead of iron. The days began to soften at their edges. He discovered that the sternness people called his professionalism was only how he had learned to guard a tenderness he didn't trust. With Mira beside him, that tenderness no longer felt like a fault line, but a riverbed. He slept better. He miscounted the hours in his favor, giving himself a sliver more time for the steps that led to the door where she waited. The nurses began to smile at him, the way people smile at someone who has found a language they were born speaking but forgot. "You're lighter," their eyes said. He was... The old loneliness had not disappeared. It had been given a hand to hold. One night, the wind came hard off the river, and the stars were bright as pins. Mira told him about the day her mother taught her to ride a bicycle in a narrow street behind their apartment. "You fall," her mother had said, "and then you breathe. You breathe until breath remembers you, and then you try again. Healing is the art of remembering how to be held by your own lungs." Mira laughed at how strange it sounded, then looked at Nathaniel. "I think I forgot how for a while." "You remembered," he said, "and when you forgot, you stayed until remembering arrived." He did not tell her she had taught him the same. They began to leave the stone steps for short walks around the block. Past midnight the city softened, and the sycamores held their shadows like sleep. She told him about the bookshop where she worked afternoons, a place that smelled of orange peel and dust, where she shelved the returns from people who thought they were done with their stories and then weren't. He told her about the drawings he used to make as a teenager, anatomy as a kind of map, how he had stopped after his father left, as if line and shape had become a language too honest to bear. "Draw again," she said simply, and in her voice was no persuasion, only a door set ajar. Later, in the quiet of his apartment, he unrolled an old portfolio and put pencil to paper. His hands shook. Then they steadied. The paper took what he had to give and gave back a piece that tasted like chamomile. In the marrow of these small unveilings, something else opened. He noticed how, when he had a hard case, Mira's presence broadened the narrowness of what was possible. He let himself sit for 5 extra minutes with a father whose son had a diagnosis that cleaved a childhood in 2. He let himself say, "This will be hard, and you will not be alone," and mean it with his entire body. He returned to the night and found Mira's eyes bright with the same wet gratitude he had seen in the chapel list. Neither of them named it love. Naming wasn't the work. The work was staying. The gift was how it began to feel. On an evening soaked in rain, Nathaniel brought an umbrella large enough to be mistaken for a room. They stood beneath it, shoulders touching, the rhythm of the downpour a drumbeat on canvas. Mira told him, softly, about the man she had once tried to love in the sharp, quick way. How grief had made her heart a skittish thing. How she had apologized for the distance that rushed in to protect her. How leaving him had felt like leaving a version of herself she did not recognize. "I thought my heart had forgotten how to open without breaking," she said. "Then you stood with me, and I learned it might be possible to open and be held." He did not answer with poetry. He answered the way one answers a child who has said something exquisitely true, by nodding, by letting the truth be enough. He did, however, let his hand rest on the edge of her scarf, a touch so light it might have been the rain itself. She did not move away. The doorways of the hospital kept doing what doorways do, admitting beginnings, releasing endings. Between those doors, on the threshold that was becoming theirs, a new room arranged itself. It had windows they opened carefully, and a table they set with simpler things. A thermos, a shortbread, a list of names held in a hymnal, a pencil sketch of Orion peering over the corner of a discharge form, a star whose name meant slow brightening. In that room, 2 lives that had learned to breathe alone began to breathe together, slowly at first, then in the steady cadence of people learning to keep time with something that feels like home. Winter bent toward late winter. The air changed, the way a heart changes right before it learns a different song. Nathaniel did not yet know that soon there would be a night when Mira did not stand at the door because she was waiting on a different threshold altogether, one he would cross with her, one in which the past, finally honored, would loosen its hold enough to let something tender and astonishing bloom. All he knew was the weight of the umbrella shared between their shoulders and the warmth in his chest when she turned her face up to the rain and smiled as if the sky itself were pouring a blessing over their quiet, faithful staying, and the next beginning was already walking toward them. The days unfolded like carefully turned pages, slow enough to savor the ink, tender enough not to tear what had been fragile for so long. Their ritual at the hospital doorway widened into a quiet life that spilled beyond the stone steps. A thermos that moved from chamomile to cinnamon cocoa, a scarf that learned the shape of her shoulders, a pencil that returned to his fingers as if it had always been waiting on the nightstand of his heart. Winter loosened its grip, not with a sudden thaw, but with small mercies, puddles not freezing over, breath no longer blooming as white, a softness to the wind that made the skin remember how spring feels even while the trees still held their grey. One evening, he showed her the drawing he'd made of Orion and Jupiter perched above the hospital's roofline, the sweep of the lamps suggested with a few quiet strokes, the doorway a rectangle of gold. He'd added, very gently, a second figure beside the first. Two silhouettes sharing a single umbrella. Mira ran her finger just above the page, as if not to smudge it, tracing the line of their shoulders, the arc of shelter overhead. "You draw the sky like you trust it," she whispered, and then, almost shyly, "Would you draw me as I am when I'm not here?" The question reached something undefended in him. "Yes," he said, and the word felt like a vow made to the future as much as to the page. Later, in the calm of his apartment, he drew her not in vigil, but in movement, hair unpinned and caught by a breeze, hands opening a book, a smile that began in the eyes and spilled down to the edges of the mouth. When he handed it to her, she pressed it to her chest, lightly, reverently, as if he had returned a piece of her that grief had hidden in the folds of time. Their world grew not by leaps, but by rooms. The first room was the bookstore where she worked. It smelled like paper warmed by afternoon sun, and the citrus peel she tucked into a porcelain bowl near the register. Bells chimed softly when he entered. She looked up, and in the moment before her smile appeared, he saw the hush inside her break into light. She showed him the alcove where children's stories slept, the corner where poetry leaned shoulder to shoulder like old friends, the table she set with fresh lilies on the 15th of each month, because that had been her mother's habit. He bought a book he already owned, just to let his receipt join the others in her till, a small proof that his days now threaded through hers. They found the second room in his kitchen, which had long been a place of silence and canned soups, and the hum of the refrigerator marking time like a metronome. She came over one evening with a paper bag of thyme, carrots, and a heavy onion that promised sweetness, if only one waited it out. They cooked slowly, letting the broth learn their names. She laughed when his eyes watered from the onion. He laughed when she admitted she always burned the first clove of garlic because she feared under-seasoning more than she feared the smoke alarm. They sat at the small table he had never used for anyone but himself and ate with the reverence people reserve for sacraments. "This is healing," she said, and he realized it wasn't the soup alone she meant, but the act of stirring a pot with someone else's breath beside you. On Sundays, when the city yawned awake, they walked the river path. Mira collected small, smooth stones and slipped them into her pocket, a habit learned from her mother. Earth's memories, she called them, pockets of calm you can carry. She gave one to him, a blue-grey oval like a thumbprint, and told him to hold it when the ward went loud inside his chest. He started keeping it in his scrub pocket. More than once, in a fluorescent hour when a monitor flared and the room pulsed with fear, his fingers found the stone and remembered the shape of her hand, steady as a shoreline. He brought her one night into the chapel when the hallway lights were dim and the janitor's broom sang a soft, bristled hymn against tile. They lit a candle beneath her mother's name, which had been typed by a volunteer with a talent for tenderness. Mira bent her head. He watched the flame make a quiet promise on their behalf. That remembrance would not always be an ache, but could be a lantern, warmth, not wound. When they stepped back into the corridor, her breath seemed longer, her shoulders less armored. He did not say anything, not even, "Are you okay?" He simply offered his elbow. She laid her hand there, and they walked toward the night as if it were a friend leaning on the fence between their yards. The smell of winter greened into the smell of thaw. Mira began to arrive earlier, just before sunset, and they learned the hospital in a new light. The glass bright with the sky's final color, the automatic doors breathing in birdsong and letting it out again. She told him about the children who traced letters on the countertop at the bookstore, about the older man who came every Thursday to read Neruda aloud to the air. He told her about a boy who hated needles but loved dinosaurs, and how he'd found a vein by pretending the tourniquet was a brontosaurus tail that needed tying. They traded these small kindnesses like gifts folded into tissue paper. At the bookstore's spring sale, she tucked a note inside a book he bought without opening. For the days you want to forget your own ache, remember, you can borrow joy. He found the note, hours later, on his coffee table, and understood he had begun to live inside a new grammar where two first-person singulars were learning the plural gently, like a shy miracle. They created a third room when she took him to the apartment where she'd lived since the sky fell. It had windows that drank in the afternoon, a fern thriving on the sill, a quilt with squares sewn from her mother's old scrubs, the tiny rocket ships, the daisies, the moons and stars. He touched the fabric and felt the soft insistence of a life that had once been all tasks and tenderness. Mira took the framed drawing he'd made of her and placed it on the bookshelf beside a photograph of her mother holding a newborn, eyes alight with the triumph that comes of coaxing breath into a reluctant world. "I like the way you place me near her," she said. "It feels like a blessing that moves forward." Their intimacy deepened in increments that felt like prayer. The way his hand learned the notch at her wrist where pulse could be counted. The way her cheek found the hollow beneath his collarbone as if carved for it. The way their breath met and matched in sleep until morning found them nested in the kind of quiet one lives a long time to deserve. There was no rush in it, no hunger to outrun the past. He could feel in her how love, to be true, had to move at the pace of trust's slow bloom. She could feel in him how love, to be healing, had to leave room for the work he had given his life to. They practiced patience the way musicians practice scales, not flashy but foundational, until their fingers knew the song before their minds named it. He drew her often, reading in a patch of sun, laughing with her head thrown back, tying her hair with one hand while balancing a cup of tea in the other. She asked him one afternoon to draw her mother from memory not his, but the shape of the woman gathered from stories, gratitude lists, lost and found notes, a nurse's music in the hallway. He tried, pencil pausing as if listening, shading eyes that had seen fear and found a way to soften it. When he turned the paper toward Mira, tears made her irises glow. "You've given her back to me in a way I can lay on my pillow," she said. And when she kissed him, it was not for the drawing alone, but for the way he had entered her history and walked there with bare feet. Their world, which had once been the width of a doorway, now included Sunday markets, rain on buses, a tiny diner that burned the toast but remembered their names. They learned to read each other's weather, the shadow that crossed his face when a code blue flashed on a pager, the quiet that fell over her when the bookstore ordered a title about loss and she had to shelve it with slow hands. He learned to hold her without fixing. She learned to let him speak the names of the children he couldn't save, and then let those names rest between them like small boats that didn't have to prove anything to be tender. It was an intimacy of presence more than performance, a balm for places that had long believed they would always ache. Yet love, when it grows honest, begins to ask for the rest of the house. The fourth room waited, one they both sensed and neither named. The room where the world outside their shelter would tug at the seams, and they would have to decide how to remain whole together. It began quietly, a murmur rather than a knock. A resident with a forehead full of hurry asked Nathaniel in the break room if he'd picked up a volunteer for the night shift, his smirk careless as a paper cut. A senior nurse, kind but protective of the unit's boundaries, pulled him aside and said, "Doctor, be careful. People talk. You deserve your softness, but make sure it doesn't cost you your standing." He smiled, thanked her, felt the warning slide under his skin like a sliver. Later, when he told Mira, she pressed a stone into his palm, a soft oval one veined with white, and said, "We can be careful and courageous at once. We can keep what is ours warm." It surfaced again in another way. The bookstore announced an author event, a return to its small stage of a poet who had dated Mira for a handful of months in a life that now felt like a distant room. "He writes well," she said, eyes steady, "but he wanted my heart to be louder than my grief before it was ready. I left with kindness, but he left with questions. If he reads a poem to the version of me that couldn't stay, will you be all right?" The question held more than an evening. It held all the tender negotiations of new love when the past has a voice. Nathaniel's answer arrived from the part of him that had learned to breathe with her. "We'll go together," he said. "We'll honor who you were and who you are." Still, that night he lay awake longer than was his habit, the old fear scratching like a branch at the bedroom window, the fear that love could be lost to the very tenderness that made it possible. Even their sanctuary, the hospital steps, shifted a shade. One twilight, as they were sharing a quiet, a mother Nathaniel had counseled hurried past, recognized his face, and then recognized Mira from a late-night cup of tea she had placed in her hands months before. The woman paused, confusion walking across her features before gratitude settled in. "You were both there," she said, tears bright. "I didn't know angels came in pairs." They laughed with her, accepted her blessing. After she left, a security guard nodded, a signal that implied, "I see you, and I'm deciding whether I need to." Nathaniel felt in his chest the old instinct to armor up. He turned to Mira, found her gaze steady, a gentle shore. "We can talk to them," she said. "We can define this room for ourselves." It was in that delicate seam, where tenderness met the world's rough edges, that their attachment deepened again, not with the sweetness of soup or the hush of candles, but with the sober warmth of two people placing their hands on the same plank and pushing in the same direction. They began to craft simple boundaries, shorter vigils on nights when his cases ran hot, a promise to name envy if it slunk in dressed as concern, a hand squeeze before entering a room others owned, as if to say, "We are on the same side, no matter who else is watching." It was not dramatic. It was daily, like changing the water for a vase of lilies before they learned to droop. Small attentions that kept the petals open. One afternoon, as the wind traded its winter bite for a mild, damp promise, they stood at the river where the path branched into two directions. Children spun on scooters. The trees, still bare, traced a kind of faith against the sky. Mira slipped her arm through his. "I used to think staying meant standing in one place until the hurt dissolved," she said. "Now I think staying might be walking when the path splits, choosing the same turn, even when the map is smudged. He looked down at her hand. A hand that had served tea to strangers held a blue-grey stone steady for him, pressed a drawing to a shelf beside a photograph that carried 1,000 breaths. "Where you turn, I turn," he said. It was not a promise against difficulty, only a promise against leaving when difficulty knocked. They walked, and the path did what paths do, curved out of sight, asked for trust. The evening drew a pearl-coloured hush over the hospital windows. From far off, a siren threaded through the city, not loud enough to alarm, just enough to remind them that every threshold in the world waits for feet like theirs to cross it. He felt the shape of the coming room, a pressure change, the way the air shifts before rain. She felt it too. He could tell by the way her fingers tightened gently, not in fear, but in readiness. They were not naive. Healing hearts are not made of sugar. They do not melt at the first warm touch. They had practiced the art of staying. Now they would learn the art of staying while the world paid attention. "Let's get tea," Mira said, and her smile carried its own weather, something temperate, something that made shoulders drop and lungs remember to be kind. They turned back toward the golden doors, the place where their story had first learned to breathe, and as they reached the steps, a familiar figure from the ward hurried out, calling Nathaniel's name, news in his posture, the kind that makes the night tilt. Nathaniel met Mira's eyes, and in the space of a single heartbeat, they placed their hands on the same plank again. Then he turned toward the call, and she turned with him, already choosing to stay on the next threshold, together. The night bent around the hospital like a held breath, glass shivering with the faint reflection of stars, the automatic doors inhaling and exhaling a tide of lives. Nathaniel felt the tilt of urgency before the pager erupted. An instinct the body earns only after long apprenticeship to thresholds. The resident's voice had carried the shape of news. Now the screen made it plain. Trauma bay, pediatric, incoming. He caught Mira's eyes on the steps, a quiet tether, a hand without moving. "Go," she said, already loosening the scarf from her throat, as if to show him she could keep warm without his coat. He nodded once and slipped into the fluorescent river. Inside, time narrowed. The boy was 8, a kaleidoscope of bruises and breath thin as paper. The room arranged itself around the child, the way galaxies arrange around gravity. The nurse with hands that could find a vein in stormlight. The respiratory tech reading the rise and fall like a hymn, the resident steadying the tremble in his own shoulders. Nathaniel entered the rhythm he knew with a precision the heart calls prayer when it has no other word. Compressions measured, medications timed to the beat of resolve, an entire team braided into one intention: stay. Hours passed differently in that room than they did on the steps outside. When at last the child's breath held its own, without the ventilator's whisper, and the monitors settled into a near-ordinary song, relief came not as applause, but as a soft unclenching. A small cup placed gently on a counter. Nathaniel washed his hands twice, as if to rinse the ache from beneath his fingernails, the ache that came whenever life was handed back like a flame that could have gone out. He stepped into the corridor and found, in the distance near the waiting area, a woman holding her face in both hands the way one holds a fragile bowl. Mira sat beside her, not fixing, not filling the silence, only lending her breath to the air there so grief would not feel alone. A cup of tea warmed the woman's palms. A neatly folded tissue waited on the armrest like the world's smallest mercy. Mira looked up when he approached, searching his expression, and when he gave the small nod that meant, "We have him for now," her shoulders softened. The woman began to cry in the surprising safety of that softness. Nathaniel stood a step back, guardian to a moment that did not require his white coat, only his agreement with the healing that presence knows how to make. The tenderness of that corridor would have carried them into the night, if not for the sudden interruption of a voice tuned not to compassion, but to order. "Sir," a security guard said, addressing Nathaniel with professional politeness sharpened by worry, "we've had a report of an unauthorized volunteer counseling families after hours. Administration asked me to confirm." Mira's hand left the woman's for a second, then returned. The mother's grief did what grief does when threatened. It went silent to protect itself. Nathaniel kept his voice even. "She's with me." The guard's eyes softened at that, but policy lived in his posture. "I understand, Doctor, but I still need to notify the charge nurse that she's here." Mira placed a final touch on the mother's shoulder, the briefest blessing, then stood. "I can step outside," she offered, gentler than the rules that prompted the moment. "It's all right," Nathaniel said. "I'll walk with you." He did not hurry her. He matched her pace, a steadying through a small public storm. At the doors, the guard met their eyes with a human look that did not have to belong to his job. "You help people," he said to Mira, quiet as a secret. "I see that." Then his radio crackled, and with a small nod, he returned to his orbit. On the steps again, the sky had deepened toward indigo, and the air held that metallic scent cities get before rain. Mira exhaled. "I don't want to be the reason your name is in someone's morning email." She attempted lightness, but the edges of her voice were tender. "You aren't," he said, and meant it. Still, he felt the splinter of the moment lodge beneath his skin. Care required 1,000 permissions. Love required almost none. The crossing between the two would need its own kind of grace. The next day's grace arrived dressed as worry. An email from administration asked for a conversation regarding after-hours interactions. The sentence was careful. The tone was neutral. The message contained the friction of a hallway rumor that had grown into a procedure. Nathaniel printed it because paper, unlike pixels, could be held until the edges stopped cutting. He brought it to the steps at dusk. Mira read it once, then again, lips pressed together as if she could keep the words from growing teeth. "We can meet them kindly," she said at last. "We can tell them the truth, that I bring tea, that I keep silence, that I leave when asked. We can tell them that staying isn't a trespass." The meeting was set for Tuesday. Before Tuesday came, the poetry event unfolded. The bookstore shone like a lantern against the early evening, its windows flanked by potted rosemary that released a scent when brushed. Folding chairs filled the narrow aisle, faces turned toward the low wooden stage where a man with careful hair and a voice tuned to the acoustics of attention stood with a paperback splayed in his hand. Mira's fingers entwined with Nathaniel's as they found seats near the back. When the poet began to read, the room tilted slightly, the way rooms do when a life you once touched steps into your present with a microphone. The poem was beautiful, and in its beauty, unkind. It didn't name her, but it named a woman who could not love because she made altars of doorways, a woman whose grief was a performance and whose silence was an excuse. The room sighed at the craft of it. The line breaks fell like a string of clever pearls. Nathaniel felt the words slide like cold glass over Mira's skin. He wanted to stand and break the poem with his hands. Instead, he did what she would do in his place. He stayed. After, the poet made his way down the aisle. He paused when he saw Mira. The history between them stood up in the space like a third person, eyes watchful. "You look well," he said, which is what people say when they mean, "You survived without me." "I am well," she replied, voice even, and then, with a gentleness that was also a boundary, "Your poem is not about me." The man smiled in the restrained way winners smile. "Art has its own truth." "And so does healing," she said. "Sometimes it looks like keeping watch with strangers. Sometimes it looks like declining to be the subject of someone else's accuracy." She squeezed Nathaniel's hand, not proof, not a possession, just a pulse of warmth that belonged to a life chosen after weather. The poet's face shifted through a sequence of expressions. Surprise, then irritation, then something like recognition that could ripen later into grace if he let it. He moved on. The rosemary brushed their sleeves on the way out, an astringent blessing. They walked through a thin rain, the kind that doesn't demand umbrellas, but turns hair into dark ropes. "I didn't know if I could do that," Mira said, a small tremor catching on the edges of her words. "Be kind to the past and faithful to now." "You did," he said, "and no poem gets to tell you who you are." He wanted to give her a stone for this, something vein-marbled and smooth, but his pockets held only keys and the printed email. He kissed her forehead, and his lips tasted rain and courage. Tuesday came. The meeting room was bright, the way rooms are bright when a table divides the people in them. A framed print of a sailboat suggested calm without earning it. The administrator's smile was precise. The charge nurse sat with an expression that paired sternness with a secret ally's wink. Nathaniel spoke first. He told the story without tilt. A woman who had lost her mother in these halls, who kept vigil with tea and restraint, who left when asked, who did not trespass in rooms or gather names, who simply learned to sit at the thresholds where pain pools so it won't drown anyone left alone. Mira spoke next. She did not plead. She described how she arrived at dusk and left before dawn, how she brought tissues and thermoses and never crossed into care that belonged to a badge, how sometimes families needed someone to say nothing beside them. "I don't want to be in the way," she said. "Only in the world." Silence considered them. The administrator shuffled a paper for the sake of time. The charge nurse leaned forward. "We are protective of our unit," she said, "not because we don't love kindness, but because we do, and because the world is full of people who take more than they give." She glanced at Nathaniel, then at Mira. "You don't feel like that kind, but perception is part of care. We have to make this official if it's to continue." They left the meeting with a small miracle, a pilot program. Evenings at the threshold, with clear boundaries drawn the way architects draw load-bearing walls. A badge that read "Companion," issued by Volunteer Services, not because the word could contain what Mira did, but because the hospital needed nouns it could laminate. Nathaniel laughed, a short, surprised sound, when the charge nurse pressed the temporary badge into Mira's palm. "We'll see how it goes," she said, which in hospital language can mean no or maybe later, or try us. Here it meant yes, in careful letters. Outside, sun varnished the edges of the sidewalk. Mira curled her fingers around the badge, her eyes bright with the complex light of relief threaded with uncertainty. "It's strange," she said, "to be seen without being swallowed." "You are not furniture," he said. "You're a lamp." She smiled, and in the shape of that smile he could already see the next room of their life arranging itself. That night, an email from the poet arrived in Mira's inbox. He apologized, awkwardly, but true. He said he'd been writing to the version of himself that wanted love to be quick and loud. He asked if she would forgive the way he had turned her into craft. Mira read the note slowly, then set the phone down and turned to Nathaniel. "I don't know if forgiveness is a door you open once," she said. "Maybe it's a window you crack a little every day." He touched her knee, a yes to whatever pace her heart chose. Days followed that felt like balm. The first evening she pinned the badge to her sweater, the way a grandmother in a yellow coat pressed a peppermint in her hand as gratitude's small coin. The sight of Nathaniel in a hallway, pausing to give a boy in a cast permission to be brave and scared at once. They learned to inhabit the spaces between rules and tenderness with honesty and care, to sign their names where the form asked, and to sign their presence where no form existed. Life, faithful to its own curriculum, brought more lessons. A colleague pulled Nathaniel aside and asked if love made him soft. "God, I hope so," he answered, and the colleague looked at him as if softness were a skill he might need to study. The boys in the ward taught him what soft could do. Coax a laugh out of a mouth full of fear, slow a heart rate with a story about a dinosaur's careful tale, make room for a mother's apology to herself. Soft, he decided, was what kept the hard from breaking. One evening in late spring, the kind of light that forgives the day lingered over the parking lot, and the city smelled of wet leaves and bakery. Mira arrived early, hair still damp from a shower that had washed the bookstore's dust from her shoulders. She lifted the badge, half smile playing on her mouth. "I keep thinking it will ask me for a different name," she said, "as if companion belongs to someone much braver." "You taught the word its job," he said. "It was just waiting for you to wear it." She started to reply, but the doors breathed open and a nurse hurried out, breath short. "Nathaniel," she called, eyes finding him. "It's the boy from last week. He's back. Oxygen sats dropping. We need you." He felt the now of it move through him like a bell. He turned to Mira, the whole shape of their world, the rooms, the river walks, the rosemary, the paper badge that somehow held a cathedral, stood in the space between that urgency and her steady eyes. "I'll be here," she said before he asked, hand finding his hand for a heartbeat, placing into it not a command, but a benediction. "Go and bring him back to breath." He went. The doors took him, the corridor narrowed, the monitors sang their fractured song. He became again the precise instrument he knew how to be, fingers remembering what love teaches them when it dresses as medicine, how to stay while the storm rages, how to be both firm and gentle, how to call a child back with the voice that says, "Stay, I have you, breathe." Hours later, the ward exhaled. There was a small sticker on his sleeve, a green dinosaur, placed there by a sister as payment for the miracle of oxygen. He didn't remove it. He carried the sticker like a medal into the night. Mira was not on the steps. The space where she stood held the cool of the stone and a whisper of jasmine from a passerby's scarf. But not Mira. For a moment, the old fear put its finger on his pulse. Then he saw it, a folded paper tucked into the corner of the bench where they sometimes left their cups to watch the sky darken, his name on the outside, written in her steady hand. He opened it, the page crackling softly, the way pages do when the words inside mattered even before they were written. "I'm at the chapel," the note read. "There is something I have been carrying to give you, and tonight is the night my hands are ready. Find me where the small flames make the air forgiving." He closed his eyes and exhaled, a breath that felt like stepping into a room already warmed for him. He looked up at the hospital, a body made of windows and will, and then down at the paper badge pinned at his own heart, the one no laminate could hold. Companion. The word glowed inside him as if it had always lived there. He turned toward the chapel, toward the soft light at the end of the corridor, toward the next threshold, a place where revelation does not ask for spectacle, only for presence. And he walked, the dinosaur sticker bright against his sleeve, the scent of rosemary and rain still in his hair, ready to take from Mira's hands whatever tenderness she had carried through the long winter to place into his. The chapel's door gave a soft sigh as he pushed it open, as if the wood itself knew how to welcome a person who had been carrying too much light and too much dark at once. Inside, the flames were small and faithful, each candle bending its halo toward the next, the air warm with wax and whispers. Mira sat in the third pew, her hands cupped around a single unlit taper, the badge pinned to her sweater catching a mote of gold. She turned when she heard his step, and in her eyes he saw both the night he had just come through and another night, older, that had been waiting for the right hour to be spoken. She rose and met him halfway, the nave a narrow river of stone between them. When she reached him, she placed the taper in his palm and held his hand around it with both of hers. "I brought something that belonged to my mother," she said, her voice steady, the steadiness of someone who has already cried and already healed and still knows how to ache with grace. "And something that belongs to me. Both want to be given." He followed her to the first row. On the kneeler lay a folded cloth pouch the color of evening. Inside, wrapped in a square of her mother's old rocket ship fabric, was a small silver pin in the shape of a caduceus, its wings worn smooth by years of brushing a collar. Beside it, tied with a blue ribbon, lay a key. Not a new key, the teeth had softened with time, but it gleamed as if it had been recently polished, as if someone had breathed on it and made it ready. Mira took the pin first. "When I was 8, she let me wear this on my sweater while we cleaned the kitchen. I remember holding myself tall as a lighthouse because I felt like people would find their way home if I remembered to shine." She placed the pin in his hand and closed his fingers over it. "I want the person who has been my lighthouse to keep it, not as a relic, but as a living thing. I want it to move with you through halls where breath is fragile and courage needs a place to lean." His throat worked around a gratitude that didn't fit into sentences. He pressed the pin to his chest before he could speak, the metal cool, a small winged promise against his heartbeat. "I'll carry her with me," he said, "in the way you've carried me. I'll try to make the air kinder where I can." Mira nodded and touched the spot where the pin rested. "The second is simpler," she said, lifting the key. "It opens both my front door and the drawer where I keep my mother's recipes, because doors and nourishment feel like the same kind of trust." She smiled, soft, a dawn kind of smile. I don't know another way to say I'm ready to make our rooms into a home except to hand you this. Come and go as your life asks, as your work demands, but know there is a table with your name woven into the wood. Know there is a light left on, because you are the one coming through. The key lay on her palm like a small, bright future. He did not reach for it quickly. He looked at her the way a person looks at water after a long walk, thankful, reverent, aware that thirst is about to learn its own ending. I will treat this like breath, he said, gently and as if the world depends on it. He took the key and felt, as it slid into his hand beside the pin, an alignment of old rooms and new. Some doors open with the quiet ease of a life that has been asking for them all along. They lit the taper together from a candle already burning, one flame kissing another until both remembered how. He held the wick steady while she cupped the air to keep out draughts. She shielded the new light until it stood on its own, a small, steady column. Then they set it in a brass holder near her mother's name, where other flames had stood their watch, and let the brightness do what brightness does best, make edges gentler without erasing them. For a while they said nothing. The chapel knew how to hold words, and the lack of them equally well. Nathaniel felt his body, trained to tighten when alarms sounded, learn again how to loosen. The dinosaur sticker still clung to his sleeve, ridiculous and tender, a badge of rescue that made him smile despite the weight of the day. Mira noticed it and touched the green shape with a fingertip. "Evidence," she whispered, "that life says yes more often than we remember." He laughed softly, and that bravery loves a tale. Her laughter joined his, easy, healing, the kind that folds itself into the air and makes a room feel bigger. Then she breathed in and let her face find its serious light again. "There's something else," she said, and sat back, leaving space for it to arrive. "I thought I would keep waiting at the doorway forever because I didn't trust myself to move without breaking what was sacred. But the badge, the pilot program, your staying, they've taught me something I didn't expect. Staying doesn't always mean standing still. It can mean walking beside. It can mean stepping in when a hand needs to be held, stepping back when silence needs a chair. I want to do that not only for strangers, but with you, for the life we're making." He took this into himself the way soil takes rain, no splash, all drinking. "Then let me ask for something that feels like a prayer," he answered. "When the ward is heavy and I forget how to come home, remind me. When I try to carry more than 2 hands can carry, say my name and put the weight down with me. And when joy arrives, make sure I don't hurry past it on my way to the next crisis. Teach me to linger." "I can do that," she said, and he could tell by the way her shoulders eased that she had just said yes to a vow she wanted. "Then you do something for me. When the past pulls me toward the door out of habit, point me toward the table. When I turn grief into work, because work feels safer than wonder, open a window. And when I forget that love is allowed to be simple, hand me a spoon and ask me to taste the soup." "It's very good soup," he said, deadpan, and they smiled at the same memory, steam lifting like a blessing above their small, earlier kitchen. The chapel's heavy clock warmed the air with a low tone. Beyond the stained glass, night pressed its quiet face to the glass of the world. Nathaniel reached into his pocket and brought out the blue-grey stone she had given him weeks ago, the one veined with white. He set it on the rail between them. "I held this today," he said, "right before I threaded a line into a vein that was trying to run away from my hands. I thought about riverbeds, about how steady makes room for movement. Your stone told me what to do." Mira took the stone, turned it, and then set it back. "It told me what to do too," she said. "Wait, but not without breathing." He touched the back of her hand. "There's a ceremony next week," he said, the thought arriving with a shiver of joy that surprised him. "The administration wants to make the program official. The charge nurse emailed. She wants to name the bench outside the doors after your mother. Not because she died here, but because she taught the hospital what it means to stay." He watched the news land in her face like light through water, shock, then disbelief, then something like gratitude finding its own feet. Her breath hitched once, and he felt it in his own lungs. "They remembered," she whispered. "No." She corrected herself, gentler. "We remembered together. That's better. They want you to speak," he added. "A few minutes, not as a saint," he smiled, "but as a daughter whose staying changed the shape of a threshold." Mira tilted her head back as if to catch rain, eyes shining in the candlelight. "I will tell them what my mother told me when I fell off a bicycle. I will tell them that breath remembers us if we give it patience." She grew quiet again, then looked at him with a question that had waited long enough to be easy. "Will you stand beside me?" "I will hold the page if your hands shake," he said, "and I will count breaths if the room forgets how." They left the chapel more slowly than they'd entered, as if their bodies wanted to memorize the way relief feels in the knees. The corridor spilled them into a hospital that had not stopped its work, footsteps that knew where they were going, laughter clipped short by doors, a janitor whistling a melody that rose and fell like a small boat. At the threshold, a family passed them, a girl in a fleece hat with stars pointing up at the dinosaur on Nathaniel's sleeve. "He's brave," she said solemnly. "He is," Nathaniel agreed, equally solemn. "He is also excellent at stickers." The girl grinned and kept walking, her mother mouthing thank you in a language older than syllables. The door breathed, the world exhaled, and the night met them with air that had learned something gentle from the candles. They walked toward the bench that would soon have a name. Mira sat and patted the stone beside her, the old ritual made new by the key in his pocket, the pin at his heart. "Tell me about the boy," she said, and in those 5 words lived 100 permissions. To speak of suffering without being swallowed by it, to lay down the day without explaining its weight, to let love be witness and not judge. He told her, not the medical narrative alone, but the moment the child's sister pressed the sticker onto his sleeve, the nurse who hummed out of tune because it calmed her own hands, the precise second when the monitor's urgent hieroglyphics translated back into music. She listened the way chapels listen. When he finished, she leaned her shoulder to his. "You brought breath back," she said, "and you let it stay this time without forgetting your own." He felt the seam of tired and glad run through him like a river that knows its banks. "I had help," he said, "from a lamp." They sat there until the hospital windows turned from black to ink to slate, that palette of blue the world paints just before admitting morning. Mira stood first and turned to him, a new brightness in her face. "There is one more thing," she said, and this time her voice carried a tremor that tasted not of fear but of joy trying to fit into a human throat. "I wrote a letter to my mother last night. Not to the past," she met his eyes, "to the part of her that keeps learning because I'm still living. I told her about you. I told her I am no longer a woman at a door. I am a woman with a key and a table and a man who keeps time with my breath. I told her I will keep staying in the way that moves. Would you hear it? Not tonight. At the ceremony. After I speak. He swallowed around the easy ache that arrives when the heart recognizes a gift too large for wrapping. I would be honored, he said. We'll make a pew into a porch and let her sit between us. She laughed softly at the image and then reached up to brush a curl back from his forehead. Her hand lingered there, a benediction so small the sky might have missed it if the sky hadn't been paying attention. Let's go home, she said. And in that sentence, home stood up like a person and opened its arms. They walked, and the city met them with a hush that was not emptiness, but space. He felt the key warm against his leg with every step, the pin steady over his heart, the dinosaur dinosauring with ridiculous dignity. In the margin of his mind, a sketch began. 2 figures on a bench beneath a plaque bearing a nurse's name, a candle in a chapel window stubborn against daylight, a door mid-swing between leaving and arriving, a story caught at the soft hinge where thresholds turn into rooms. By the time they reached her building, a thin line of pink had confessed itself to the horizon. She opened the door and let him in first, a reversal that felt like a sacrament. Inside, the fern on the sill had stretched 2 new fronds. The quilt made from scrubs glowed with the ghost light of coming day, and the room smelled faintly of orange peel and thyme. Holmes' handwriting. She set water to boil. He set the pin gently in a small bowl on the bookshelf beside the drawing he'd made and the photograph of her mother performing that everyday miracle of catching a breath. When the tea steeped, they stood at the window with steaming cups. The city brightened by increments, as if the sun, too, had learned from them to arrive with patience. Nathaniel exhaled and felt the breath travel all the way to his heels. "We will have to tell people," he said after a while, not as worry, but as a simple next step. "Not just the hospital, but our friends, your poet, the man at the diner who pretends not to know my order." Mira smiled into her cup. "We will," she said. "We will let the world witness without deciding. We will let it bless us more than it questions us. And when it questions us, we will light a candle and answer with presence." They drank, and their silence was not empty. It was full of everything they had promised, and everything they didn't need to promise, because their bodies already knew how. When the kettle clicked back to quiet, Mira set her cup down and took his free hand, thumb circling the groove where the stone had lived earlier. "Sleep," she said, and the word unspooled the rest of the night's tightness. He lay down on the quilt, stitched from a life of service, and let his muscles write a different kind of record. Here is where love came and did not rush. Here is where it stayed and did not harden. Here is where it warmed and did not burn. He drifted with the shape of her beside him and woke hours later to sunlight drawing a neat square on the wall. The day of the ceremony waited on the calendar like a steady drumbeat, and beyond it, other days, other thresholds. He turned on his side to watch her sleep and thought of the bench, the plaque, the letter to a mother who was still learning in the marrow of her daughter's hope. Outside, the city began its gentle clatter. Inside, 2 breaths found their shared rhythm and held it. When Mira's eyes opened, they were full of that specific morning clarity that makes a person brave. "Today," she said. "We practice our words." She reached for a notebook and tore a page cleanly. "You keep this," she added, placing the blank sheet in his hand, "for what you need to say to yourself when the room is full and the world is listening." He looked at the page as if it were a doorway he could carry. "I'll write only one sentence," he answered. "I'll write, 'Stay.'" Mira smiled. "Then we're ready." Daylight stepped into the room. They rose and dressed, their movements unhurried, their touch a language. As they left the apartment, he locked the door and felt the key's weight like a promise that did not ask for ceremony to be true. Down the stairs, through the morning, toward the hospital whose doors had once been the whole of their story and now were only its beginning, they walked, not faster than breath, not slower than trust, toward a bench that would hold a name, toward a letter that would speak, toward a threshold about to open and show them once more how love chooses to stay by learning how to move. The morning of the ceremony broke like silk being unfolded, the sky stretching open with the kind of clarity that felt appointed rather than accidental. Sunlight spilled across the city, tender on the windows, gilding even the most ordinary bricks, as if the world itself had decided to dress in celebration. Nathaniel and Mira walked together toward the hospital, their steps aligned, their silence charged with the pulse of 1,000 unsaid things that lived comfortably between them. The badge pinned over her heart gleamed softly. The small silver pin he now wore shone beside his own name, as though her mother's legacy and his duty had become threads braided into one. In his pocket, the key pressed its quiet weight against him, a reminder that home was no longer a single room, but a presence waiting behind every door they crossed together. When they arrived, the hospital had transformed into something more than glass and steel. Staff gathered near the entrance, faces lit not by fluorescent duty but by expectation, children with casts and stickers holding flowers in paper cups, volunteers arranging chairs as though setting a table for family. At the center stood the new bench, polished wood gleaming under the early sun. A small brass plaque had been fastened to it, the letters etched with care. "In memory of Nurse Eliza Hart, whose staying taught us how to heal." Mira's breath caught at the sight. Her hand pressed to her lips, and Nathaniel felt her tremble not with sorrow, but with the weight of recognition. The name that had been carried in whispered stories, in folded fabric, in candle flames, now had a place where strangers could sit and learn her mother's lesson without even knowing her face. When the charge nurse stepped forward to speak, her voice carried the hush of reverence that filled the air. She spoke of thresholds, of how a doorway is more than an entrance. It is where courage is borrowed, where grief exhales, where love keeps watch. She gestured toward Mira. "This daughter has taught us that legacy is not a memory frozen in the past," she said, "but a living presence we keep by choosing to stay, by choosing to hold each other." Then she invited Mira forward. Mira's hands shook slightly as she unfolded the paper she had tucked into her notebook, the letter written to her mother in the quiet hours of dawn. Nathaniel stood beside her, close enough that she could lean if her knees faltered, steady enough that she knew she wouldn't need to. She lifted her voice, and the words unfurled like a prayer stitched to the air. She told of the bicycle lesson, of breath remembering the body, of the way her mother's kindness lingered not in records but in small mercies. Scarves tied, tea brewed, nights kept gentle for those afraid of dawn. Then she spoke of now, of the bench, of the badge, of the man standing beside her, who had taught her that staying could also mean moving forward without losing the sacredness of what had come before. As she read, the sunlight touched her face, and for a moment Nathaniel saw both mother and daughter braided together in her expression, two generations of women who had chosen to turn loss into light. When she finished, the silence that followed was not emptiness but fullness, the kind of stillness that falls when every soul present has felt something shift inside them. Then the applause rose, not loud, not frantic, but steady, as though the clapping itself were a heartbeat that belonged to all of them. Afterward, families approached. A grandmother pressed Mira's hand and whispered, "Your mother once stayed with my grandson all night. I never forgot." A boy climbed onto the bench, swinging his legs, then looked up at her with the solemnity only children can carry. "I think your mum would like this seat." Nathaniel watched as Mira received each word not as burden, but as balm, her face shining with the strange healing that comes when grief is honored in community. Later, as the crowd thinned, Nathaniel and Mira sat together on the bench itself, letting the sunlight gather on their shoulders. He took her hand, turning it palm up, tracing the lines as though reading a map. "This is not just your mother's name anymore," he said softly. "It is the name of every person who has learned to keep vigil, to stay when it would be easier to walk away. You've given the world more than memory. You've given it a practice." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "And you," she whispered, "you've given me back a future I thought had vanished. My mother taught me to stay. You've taught me that staying can be shared, that it can be warm, that it can be love." Her words wrapped around him like a bandage, not hiding the wound, but helping it mend. As dusk approached, the hospital lights flickered on, echoing the first night they had found each other in the doorway. But tonight, the shadows did not carry only sorrow. They held a softer hue, one that shimmered with possibility. They walked away together, leaving behind the bench as a beacon for others, carrying within them the unspoken vow that this was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a home built on thresholds transformed into rooms. And now, dear soul who has walked through these words with us, if you have felt even a flicker of healing, if the story has warmed something quiet in your heart, I invite you to let it live beyond this page. Leave a comment to share your light. Press like to honor the staying that love demands. And subscribe so you may journey with us again into stories that soothe, mend, and remind us that love, when chosen daily, becomes the most powerful healer of all. Your presence matters here. Stay with us, and let's keep walking toward hope together.